Thank you.
For more on the latest testimony, let's get to our legal panel now. John Manuelian is a criminal defense attorney. Dan Schorr is a former prosecutor. And in Sanford, Susan Constantine, a jury consultant who's been in the courtroom for the trial. Thank you all for being with us. Dan, let me begin because you were a former prosecutor. This expert witness made 3 points. He said, A, the clarity of this is poor. B, it is brief, only 3 seconds long, the scream. And third, it's a scream. It's not a normal voice pattern. I wonder if it was a mistake for prosecutors to put this expert on the witness stand because all 3 of those things would diminish the Martin parents from taking the witness stand and saying, oh, that's my son.
I agree that this witness did not help the prosecution. However, the defense would call this witness on their defense case if the prosecution didn't. And so the prosecution had to call this witness and try to get as much out of them as they could. They're trying to set up the fact that the parents can identify Trayvon Martin's voice. That's going to be problematic because they're going to be seen as emotionally involved in the case and wanting a particular outcome through no fault of their own. They won't be seen as objective witnesses. And you also have the testimony of John Good, who testified last week, an seemingly impartial neighbor who believes that George Zimmerman was the one calling for help. So this witness really did not help the prosecution, but they probably had to call him.
You know, and John, isn't it a wash because you're going to have people on both sides? I mean, Zimmerman's father is going to say, that's my son. Trayvon Martin's mother will say, that's my son. And he probably can't call Trayvon Martin's dad to the witness stand because he initially said, it's not my son, and now he says, it is my son. The whole thing's a wash, isn't it?
And also, Trayvon Martin's dad said he thought he was George Zimmerman. So that doesn't really help the prosecution in this case. And you're right, it is a wash. But ultimately, what it's going to come down is common sense. Why did Trayvon Martin have his knees wet on the grass? And why was George Zimmerman on the bottom? Who was the aggressor? Who was the one with the injuries? And if you use reasonable common sense, you would say that George Zimmerman was the one that was getting the best of him. So that's going to be something that the prosecution has to overcome in order to get a reasonable doubt guilty verdict.
Susan, you're the jury expert and you've been inside the courtroom. I'm told by our producer that these jurors are taking fastidious notes. In fact, ran out of notebooks and the bailiff had to go back and get more notebooks for them to write in. But our producer said, especially when John Good took the witness stand called by the prosecution, and it was Good who said Zimmerman was the victim. Trayvon Martin was attacking him. What do you make of that?
Well, what we have to look for, first of all, is what is being spoken at that specific time, what jurors are making note, and then watching their nonverbal cues of who's leaning in to get closer into the witness's proxemics, tilting their head. Who are the ones of the active listeners, and then what are they jotting down? And what you can find is that there is a pattern of what's important to each one of those specific jurors, but they are really paying a lot of attention, not taking as much notes today as they are listening, and then after they hear something that's important to them, they're jotting it down.
You know, Dan, prosecutors had to call John Good to the witness stand because under Florida law, if they don't, that allows the defense to say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution was trying to hide a witness, John Good. But in the end, was Good a disaster for the prosecution?
Absolutely. He confirms the defense. Before this trial started, it seemed that George Zimmerman would have to testify because he wants to put forward his self-defense claim. But now that you have John Good testifying that Zimmerman appeared to be on the bottom of the fight before he shot Trayvon Martin, maybe now George Zimmerman won't even need to testify because self-defense has already been put forth into the facts of the case to be decided by the jury by the prosecution. So it was a real problem for the prosecution. As you said, they had to call him, but it certainly didn't help them.
And John, to that point, in addition to John Good, do you think forthcoming the defense will be able to get their client's testimony in through the reporting police officers? After all, he gave a great many statements to them, including a videotaped reenactment the next day.
Yeah, that might also be a judgment call as to how much of that evidence is going to come in without the testimony. Typically in a self-defense case, a defendant needs to testify as to his own version of events, but since in this case the prosecution has had enough time to get statements from Zimmerman, specifically the videotape statements that is given the police, He went on a police ride and he explained everything to what happened. There's a potential that he may not go on the stand because everything has already come out through other pieces of evidence.
Yeah. All right, Susan, last question to you. If Zimmerman chooses not to take the witness stand, there'll be a jury instruction from the judge to the jury that says, you know, he has a perfect right to do that. You're not to hold it against him. But don't jurors, by and large, yearn to hear from the lips of the accused, I didn't do it? And if that doesn't happen, sometimes they do hold it against him?
You know what? There's different opinions about that, but certainly most jurors will tell you they want to hear their side of the story. But in this case, I believe that there's so much, circumstantial evidence here. That there's not. I don't think that Zimmerman really needs to take the stand in this particular case.
Right.
I think Go ahead.
No, that's all right. There are conflicting. I got to wrap it up. There are conflicting accounts here. And look, if jurors get back into the jury room, scratching their heads, saying, "I can't figure out what happened that night," that equals automatically under the law reasonable doubt. John Manueli and Dan Schorr, Susan Constantine, thank you both. Please come back as the trial continues.
Thank you.
And speaking of which, our continuing coverage of the George Zimmerman trial is streaming live on FoxNews.com. All you have to do is log on to our homepage and click on the link on the right-hand side of the page. Jenna?
I was doing that all Friday afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great video stream. Well, tensions in Egypt now at a boiling point as